Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Daniel Peña y dirijo la Cátedra Camoes, la Cátedra Luis de Camoes, creada por la Fundación Ramón Areces y la Universidad Carlos III de Madrid para impulsar la cooperación en materias culturales y científicas, especialmente entre España y Portugal, especialmente en el mundo universitario. La Cátedra es coorganizadora de este ciclo con la Fundación Areces. Esta conferencia forma parte de un ciclo de 3, una de las cuales ya se ha impartido y las otras 2 las hemos podido recuperar online gracias a la eficaz trabajo de la Fundación. Y este ciclo de conferencias está dedicado a la vuelta al mundo de Magallanes-Elcano, causas y consecuencias de las mismas. Quiero dar las gracias por todo su apoyo y su esfuerzo porque este ciclo siguiera adelante al director de la Fundación, don Raimundo Pérez Hernández, y también a todo el excelente equipo de la Fundación que ha hecho posible que hayamos podido retomar este ciclo de conferencias de la mejor forma posible, dadas las circunstancias. La conferencia que vamos a escuchar hoy está dedicada a analizar especialmente las relaciones entre los dos grandes imperios ibéricos, España y Portugal, en el momento en que se realiza el viaje. Hoy, hace 500 años, en este mes de octubre, en la primavera austral, que 4 de los 5 barcos que formaban la escuadra de Magallanes, ha perdido uno en el invierno. Esta escuadra, que partió de Sanlúcar de Barrameda en septiembre de 1959 y ahora, en este mes de octubre, se adentra en el archipiélago que forma el estrecho entre el Atlántico y el Pacífico y que hoy llamamos de Magallanes, en su camino hacia las Islas Molucas. Todavía tendrán que pasar 2 años de duras penalidades hasta que una única nave, de las 5 que partieron, la nave Victoria, dirigida por Elcano, sea capaz de regresar al punto de partida el 6 de septiembre de 1522, después de dar por primera vez la vuelta al mundo. La conferencia de hoy, que como he comentado, va a estar centrada sobre todo en las relaciones entre las dos grandes potencias marítimas del momento, será impartida por el profesor Francisco Bethencourt. El profesor Francisco Bethencourt es Charles Boxer Professor of History at King's College London desde 2005. Va a impartir, aunque entiende perfectamente el castellano, obviamente el inglés es un idioma más adecuado para una conferencia profunda como esta, y va a impartir su conferencia en inglés. Anteriormente fue director del Centro Gulbenkian de París, director de la Biblioteca Nacional de Portugal y profesor de la Universidad Nueva de Lisboa. Es un investigador muy destacado, con libros y artículos muy influyentes y citados sobre la expansión y los descubrimientos portugueses desde 1400 y el Imperio Portugués. También es muy conocido por su investigación pionera sobre el racismo y su famoso libro Racism from the Crusades to the 20th Century, publicado por Princeton University Press, y es muy conocido y ha tenido una amplia difusión. La conferencia, que vamos a tener el placer de escucharle hoy, tiene por título The Impact of Magellan's Circumvocation of the Globe. Profesor Bethencourt, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias. Quería agradecer a la Fundación Ramón Areces por esta invitación y también el profesor Daniel Peña por todo el trabajo de organización. Pido perdón de no hablar en español en esta conferencia. Lo haré en inglés. Entonces, el primer slide de esta conferencia. The first unintentional voyage of circumnavigation of the world, organized in 1519 by the Portuguese Fernão Magalhães, Magellan, and sponsored by the Castilian crown, reflected both rivalry and cooperation between Portuguese and Castilians in overseas exploration and colonization. The original intention was to assert that the Moluccas Islands were part of the Castilian area of world navigation defined by the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed by the two crowns in 1494. The plan was to navigate through a possible southwestern connection between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean and back. However, the failure to find the route back to the Americas after the death of Magellan in what became later the Philippines led the survivors of the expedition to choose the well-known Portuguese maritime route back to Europe via the Cape of Good Hope. The voyage was made possible by the Portuguese presence in Southeast Asia, which registered a turning point with the conquest of Malacca in 1511, immediately followed by the exploration of the existent maritime connections to Timor and the Moluccas. We can see, and this is the figure number 2, so we can see from a Portuguese map drawn around 1502 and taken to Italy by Alberto Cantino, the agent of the Duke of Ferrara in Portugal, that Southeast Asia was not very well represented. In 1512, the governor of the Estado da Índia, Afonso de Albuquerque, sent to the Portuguese King Manuel a map of the Southeast Asia drawn by a Javanese pilot. This map must have inspired Francisco Rodrigues, who navigated to Moluccas in 1511, 1512, returned to Malacca in 1512, and drew around 30 maps until 1515, in which he tried to represent all the region, including places he had not visited. And we have another figure here, figure 3. It's the map of Borneo and a part of Java and some of the islands around. So we have selected here these 2 maps of the extreme southeast focused on Borneo, and the next map is focused on the Moluccas. So we have this range of, it's this. This map is focused on the Moluccas, where you had nutmeg, where you have some of the spices that would be part of the trade between Asia and Europe. So in 1718, this knowledge was integrated by Pedro Reinel in his map of the Indian Ocean. And we have another map here, exactly, in which you can see that India is slightly, the east coast of Africa is already well represented. India is slightly better represented, and the Southeast Asia started to be better represented. So the voyages would give information, and this would be immediately represented by the royal cartographers, both in Portugal and in Castile. In 1519, the same Reinel, a Portuguese cartographer who had moved to Sevilla, drew a more ambitious world map dated 1519, and you have another figure now, in which the connection between the Atlantic and the Pacific through the southern tip of the New World seems wide open, and the Moluccas Islands are oversized. And this is very interesting. So the commercial interest was reflected on cartography. It is fascinating to contrast this cartography that favors the interest of Castile to the Atlas Miller executed in 1519 by commission of the Portuguese King Manuel, in which the opening world map drawn by Lopo Homem represents a southern continent around the Antarctic that seems to close the passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And it is this map where you confront the previous and this new map, and you see the different interests at stake. So for the Castilians, there would be an open connection between the Atlantic and the future called Pacific Ocean. And for the Portuguese, they wanted to represent this closeness. The following maps I will introduce here were drawn by Michel Chondaigne under the pseudonym Xavier de Castro. in the best edition of all contemporary texts related to Magellan's voyage, they give us these maps an accurate vision of Magellan's circumnavigation. And so you have the different stages of the voyage in these maps. You can see how they were very well reconstituted. You have still new maps here. Basically, we have 5 maps here. So other figures, yes, can be represented. This is the connection to the Pacific Ocean. And as we know, it was many years later, more or less 40 years later, that the system of winds and currents were decoded, and you could sail back to the New World. And in this case, Magellan was not aware of this system, and his sailors were not aware. So they decided to, they didn't manage to return by the same route, and they went via the Cape Cod. And you have another map here with this situation in the Philippines, in which the future Philippines, in which Magellan was killed. And then you have the voyage back via the Cape, the Cape of Good Hope. And you have still another map representing the passage through the Atlantic, through the islands via the islands of Cape Verde, and then Azores and back to Sevilla. Finally, in 1529, the map of Diogo Ribeiro, another Portuguese cartographer at the service of Charles V, integrates the circumnavigation voyage of Magellan and the development of the Iberian voyages. This preamble on cartography is important for 2 reasons. First, to underline indigenous information that oriented the Portuguese in the area. The Javanese could draw maps as many other peoples in Asia. Southeast Asia has a complex system of navigation, and without local help, it would have been much harder to find the way. I should also underline that Magellan acquired a slave in 1511 in Malacca called Henrique, probably from Sumatra, according to the author of the major account of the voyage, Antonio Pigafetta. This slave, who might have provided important information being used as translator, followed Magellan to Europe and back to Asia, being part of the expedition. He defected after the death of his master. The second reason for this preamble is to highlight the entanglement of Portuguese and Castilian knowledge in geography and cartography, with navigators and cartographers moving from one kingdom to the other. The impact of this first voyage of circumnavigation may be analyzed in 3 dimensions: the exploration of the system of winds and currents of the Pacific, and the development of accurate measurement of the world, the effort to extend both empires into the Pacific, and the identification of new markets and new commodities. Political and economic interests between Castile and Portugal became more and more entangled during the following decades, which would arguably contribute to the unification of the Iberian crowns in 1580. The social dimension of intercontinental maritime trade played a major role in this process. Finally, the expansion of the Iberian worlds needs to be firmly placed on the international context of Christianity, divided by the Reformation, the expansion of the Ottoman and the Chinese empires, the economic importance of Western Africa, the colonization of the Americas, and the exploration of Asia. And I will address here now the Iberian rivalry and cooperation. The conquest of Ceuta by the Portuguese king in 1415 is usually identified as the start of the Iberian oceanic expansion, but rivalry between Portugal and Castile in the area had been looming around the conquest of Canary Islands since the 14th century, which was implemented by the Castilians during the 15th century with regular Portuguese intrusion. In the late 1410s, Madeira started to be colonized by the Portuguese, who also discovered and colonized the Azores from the 1420s and the Cape Verde Islands from the 1450s onwards. In 1479, the Treaty of Kalakasovich was signed between the Portuguese King Alfonso V and the Castilian Queen Isabel to overcome civil war and Portuguese intervention in the succession to the crown of Castile. In this treaty, the right of Castile to conquer the Canary Islands was established, while Portugal had their legal rights over the other Atlantic islands and the maritime expansion to the south recognized, thus defining the first attempt to divide oceanic expansion between the two powers. This north-south partition was replaced by east-west pole-to-pole line 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, consecrated by the Treaty of Tordesillas. This line enlarged much further to the west, a first line defined by several bulls of Pope Alexander VI in 1493. In practice, the partition of the Atlantic had been extended deep into the hinterland of what would be South America, which in the 19th century raised speculation that the Portuguese might have known about Brazil before the first trip of Pedro Álvares Cabral in 1500. However, the continuation of the pole-to-pole line in the opposite hemisphere was only pushed to the front line of diplomatic conflict when the Portuguese conquered Malacca in 1511 and started to explore previously established trade with Southeast Islands, mainly the Moluccas, for clove, nutmeg, and mace, and Timor for sandalwood. While pepper was the main commodity then traded to Europe, which would keep its high value until the end of the 16th century, the rise of other commodities in the 1510s and 1520s, such as cinnamon from Ceylon or Sri Lanka, offered diversity with the advantage of escaping royal monopoly. Magellan was a ship captain in the Indian Ocean from 1505 to 1512 and participated in the Portuguese expeditions to Malacca. He was aware of these commodities highly demanded in China, South Asia, and Iran through regular correspondence with his friend Francisco Serrão, who stayed in the Moluccas from 1512 until his death in 1521. Magellan returned from India in 1513 in time to participate in the conquest of Azamur in North Africa the same year. He was made knight and then commendador of the military order of Santiago. In 1517, after recovering a significant debt and disappointed by the meager reward given by the Portuguese king, he decided to move to Castile and offer his services to Charles V, who accepted to sponsor the expedition to Moluccas. Magellan married the daughter of Diogo Barbosa, another Portuguese, governor of the forts and arsenal of Sevilla. Magellan set sail in September 1519, 3 months after Charles V had been elected emperor. 5 ships and 237 men were involved in the expedition, including 31 Portuguese. 1 ship and 18 Europeans returned after 3 years in September 1522. Rivalry and cooperation between Portugal and Castile were thus embedded into the first stages of oceanic exploration. Information on cartography, commodities, and markets flew between Lisbon and Sevilla, coupled by constant migration of sailors, cartographers, and merchants, who invested and participated in each other's expeditions, trespassing state boundaries and challenging royal accusations of treason. Columbus, who went with Genoese merchants to Iberia, married in Madeira and invested in West African trade before he offered his services to the Castilian queen. The Portuguese participated in several Castilian expeditions to the New World, mainly as captains, pilots, and sailors, but there was an architect with Cortés, Diogo de Lisboa, who left his imprint on main buildings in Mexico. This pattern of cross-migration in maritime economy replicated the previous model of court society. A significant number of noblemen circulated among Iberian and other European royal courts due to matrimonial alliances but also due to the dynamics of power, which involved the escape of unfavored or disgraced courtiers. The Iberian exploration of the Atlantic had been driven by the search for dyes, precious metals, and cod, followed by the transfer and adaptation of sugarcane, while the transfer of manioc, maize, and tomato from the Americas to Africa and Europe was underway. The European exploration of Asia was driven by the search of spices, coupled by Indian textiles and later Chinese porcelain. European manufacturing had an impact both on Africa and the New World, but not on Asia, where the acquisition of local commodities had to be bought with European and then American silver. In September 1519, when Magellan's trip started, Cortés had arrived in Mexico 5 months earlier and was building up his local alliances to prepare the attack on Tenochtitlan. The conquest of Mexico can be analyzed as a parallel, although unintended, process of the voyage of circumnavigation of the globe. When Cortés completed the conquest of Mexico, the South Sea or the Pacific Ocean became the new frontier. And now I will talk about the Portuguese expansion. In the meantime, in Asia, the Portuguese had conquered Goa in 1510, Malacca in 1511, and Hormuz in 1515, which would become the backbone of the Estado da India for 1 century. As we know, the main novelty brought by the Portuguese to Asia was the maritime connection via the Cape of Good Hope. But they also brought with them artillery on ships never used before in the Indian Ocean, which gave them an advantage over traditional Pacific trade to impose temporary control of the main routes of navigation. In 1515, the Portuguese sent the first embassy to the Emperor of China, which failed its goal, but they were already exploring Southeast Asia and China up to Guangdong. The dynamics of Portuguese and Castilian expansion were not synchronized by the time of Magellan's expedition. The conquest of the Canary Islands, completed by the end of the 15th century by the Castilians, brought some wealth via the collection of orchil, a violet dye stuff from lichens for the European market. Then the introduction of sugarcane, vineyards, wheat, and bees, crucial for the production of honey, and the diffusion of animals such as the horse. Canary Islands' importance was due to its long-term role as an important scale for the European economy based on ship repair and food supply. The occupation of the main Caribbean islands by the Castilians had immediate consequences due to the plunder of gold, but dramatic decline of local population transformed those islands into pasture for cattle breeding and export of hides to Europe, an important commodity not yet significant in 1519. The occupation of the mainland, triggered by the conquest of Mexico, brought new important riches, and the vision of a Castilian search for territory contrasted to Portuguese search for trade, a topic launched by Cortés, but with little correspondence to reality, since occupation depended on local conditions. The fact is that Portuguese expansion was far ahead of the Castilian one by 1519, although the occupation of the main ports on the coast of Morocco had meant a huge financial investment with very little return for the crown. But as elsewhere, many individuals and social groups benefited from trade in North Africa. The population of Madeira Island was much more successful due to the diffusion of sugarcane plantation. In the last decades of the 15th century, Madeira became the main producer and exporter of sugar to Europe. Although the competition from the southern Moroccan region of the Suez started to bite in the 1520s, Madeira's production kept some importance during the 16th century. Portuguese engagement with slave trade from West Africa became significant in the second half of the 15th century and fed colonization of the Americas from the 1520s onwards. Extremely important was the creation of the Fort of Elmina in the Gulf of Guinea in 1480, which traded gold collected in the hinterland, then the major region of gold production in the world. The discovery of the coast of nowadays Brazil in 1500 brought with it the exploration of a rich dyestuff, Brazil wood, which gave the name to the land and triggered another royal monopoly run through concessions to private exploitation. The introduction of sugar plantation had to wait for the mid-16th century. More important then was the Carreira da India, established after the voyage of Vasco da Gama to the Indian Ocean in 1497-99. The access to pepper in the Malabar coast via Cochin was very well established by 1519, while the trade of nutmeg and maize from the Moluccas, silk and porcelain from China, and horses from Persia to South Asia started to have some impact. The royal revenue from the empire, coupled by taxation of trade from the empire, represented already 64% of the total revenue in 1506. Value increased to 67% in 1519. The royal income from the empire thus reached very early a staggering proportion of the royal revenue. It meant that the collection of taxes in Portugal was still at a relatively low level, which would be corrected in time, even if the revenue from the empire still represented 54% in 1619, declined to 30% in 1681, but recovered to 35% in 1716 with the gold of Brazil and reached 55% in 1766. It is true that Portuguese empire played a crucial role in the royal finances, although protection costs absorbed most part of the revenue. And this is interesting because the level of income from the empire was much higher than in the case of the Spanish Empire or the British Empire. Moreover, the empire played a very important role in the long term for the gross domestic product of Portugal. Around 1/5, according to the study by Leonor Freire Costa, Jaime Reis and Nuno Palma. It is difficult to evaluate private benefits beyond this indicator, but more than 1.5 million Portuguese emigrated overseas from 1415 to 1800, including many peasants, artisans, and noblemen. Migration alleviated pressure on Portuguese economic and social structures, while it contributed to create and explore markets overseas. My argument is that the Portuguese Empire was producing relatively more income than the Spanish Empire by 1519. It increased dramatically royal revenue and benefited a significant number of people directly and indirectly involved with trade overseas. New Christians of Jewish origin, conversos, and forgive me for bringing the topic of my next book into this conference, played a major role in the early contracts of pepper in 1509-1511. Álvaro Pimentel, Duarte Tristão, and Jorge Lopes Bichorda were the three contractors with higher levels of investment, but there were also German, the Ram family, and Castilian merchants like Cristóbal de Haro at that level. Among the Portuguese and Castilian traders who delivered silver to the Mint House of Lisbon around 1519, New Christians had again a significant share. Francisco Mendes, the husband of the famous Garcia Nassi, who fled to Antwerpia, Venice, and finally Istanbul, after Francisco died in 1532, was Francisco the biggest investor. But we also find Jorge Lopes Bichorda, Francisco Rodrigues, Diogo Lopes, Henrique Nunes, Fernão Pérez, Duarte Tristão. Cristóbal de Haro, an active Castilian trader from Burgos, present in Lisbon, already mentioned, became disappointed with King Manuel and went back to Castile, where he promoted and sponsored the voyage of Magellan. It is this enormous trade activity and merchant links that must have attracted the interest of the royal court of Charles V for Magellan's expedition. Now, I will address the global political context. The voyage of Magellan opened the way for intercontinental links across the Pacific. At that time in the Far East, the Ming dynasty was at its peak in China, and the struggle among daimyo for supremacy in Japan was looming. In South Asia, the conquest of the Delhi Sultanate of Lodi by Babur, Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad, in 1526, triggered the creation of the Mughal Empire through the integration of a significant number of Muslim sultanates in northern India. Opposed to the centralization of Muslim power was still the Vijayanagara Empire, which then controlled South India. In the meantime, the Middle East went through a significant political reorganization. The Safavid dynasty reunited Iran in the early 1500s under Shah Ismail I, who also conquered Armenia and Azerbaijan. He triggered the first stage of a reconversion of the largest Sunni population into Shia Islam. The Ottoman Empire and the Selim I, and they both reigned in very similar periods, Ismail I until 1523 and Selim I until 1520. So the Ottoman Empire engaged in an enormous expansion with the conquest of Egypt and part of the Arabian Peninsula, including a celebrated victory over Shah Ismail I in Iran in 1514. The Ottoman Empire in 1520 spanned nearly 1.5 million square kilometers. In the first decades of the 16th century, the Mamluk and the Ottoman Navy had tried to oppose the Portuguese maritime expansion in the Western Indian Ocean, but they were defeated. The Portuguese managed to keep Hormuz in the Persian Gulf for more than 1 century, but failed their attempts to conquer Aden. In Africa, south of Egypt, the Christian Coptic kingdom of Ethiopia, which had raised the interest of Latin Europe in the late Middle Ages, was the target of several Portuguese missions until the diplomatic expedition of 1520 established a permanent exchange which would last more than 1 century. In East Africa, the establishment of a fort in the islands of Mozambique in 1507 opened regular contacts with Sofala and the gold trade from the empire of Monomotapa, or the Confederation of Monomotapa. In West Africa, the major political entity was the Songhai Empire, which had managed to acquire part of the territory of the Mali Empire in the decline. However, the region was defined by small and medium-sized political units, among which the important kingdom of Benin. The Portuguese presence in the region related to gold and slave trade was based on steady migration of new Christians of Jewish origin to the rivers of Guinea and Cape Verde. The occupation of the islands of Saint Tomé and Príncipe, south of the Gulf of Guinea, was driven by the plantation of sugarcane, with an impact on slave trade from the coast. In Central West Africa, the Portuguese managed to establish a stable relationship with the Kingdom of Congo, although its rule over a significant territory was under constant threat. In Europe, Charles V, who had become King of Castile and Aragon in 1516, Archduke of Austria and Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, ruled over vast territories, which included Burgundy, Flanders, South Italy, Sicily, and Sardinia. The French king, Francis I, who reigned from 1515 to 1547, got involved in the Italian wars. He would be defeated and imprisoned at the Battle of Pavia in 1525. He had to give the Duchy of Milan and northern French territories to Charles V. The French kingdom was the main Christian power opposing Charles V in Europe. It felt encircled by the Habsburg territories and made an alliance with the Ottoman Empire. The flow of gold and later silver from the Americas increased the financial capacity of Charles V. This is why his support to Magellan's voyage was astute. He saw the strategic importance of overseas exploration and colonization to obtain new resources for his imperial universalist project, already pushed by his advisors, particularly by Mercurino di Gattinara, who became Charles V's chancellor in 1521. It was against this background that Magellan's expedition was launched. At that moment, the Portuguese had controlled the main routes of the Indian Ocean and were exploring new markets on the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, East Africa, west and east coast of India, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia and the Far East, although Japan would only be reached in the 1540s. Magellan's intrusion was seen as a threat to that expansion. The Portuguese King Manuel, who reigned from 1495 to 1521, was informed of the departure of Magellan's expedition. He gave instructions to capture the ships and crew involved in case they would cross the areas of Portuguese maritime expansion recognized by the Treaty of Tordesillas. He even sent 6 ships to Asia under the command of Jorge de Brito to intercept Magellan's expedition. They managed to capture the now Trindade in Ternate, Moluccas, with its artillery, crew, and provisions. They had returned after a failed attempt to find a way back to the New World. 19 survivors were captured and sent to Malacca and Cochin. Only 5 arrived in Lisbon. The others died or escaped. This harshness was followed by diplomatic exchanges. Manuel's successor, King John III, engaged with extensive negotiations with his double brother-in-law, Charles V, which led to the Treaty of Saragossa in 1529, according to which the Portuguese would retain the Moluccas against the payment of 350,000 gold ducats. And now I will address the impact of Magellan's navigation, which was the culmination of a long sequence of voyages. It is disputable whether it represented a turning point at the same level of the voyages of Columbus and the Vasco da Gama. It certainly opened up the exploration of the Pacific directly from Spain, with the expeditions sponsored by Charles V of Sebastiano Caboto, Garcia Jofre de Loyasa, and Esteban Gomez in 1525-26, but also from New Spain, an expedition sent by Cortés in 1527, commanded by Álvaro de Saavedra. They all failed either to get into the Pacific Ocean, arrive at the Moluccas, or find the return trip, leaving sailors and soldiers detained by the Portuguese. The Treaty of Saragossa in 1529 can be interpreted as an acceptance of failure by Charles V. The expedition by Magellan did not cover the costs, but the following expeditions were even more disastrous. Cristóbal de Haro was one of the investors hardly hit by these expeditions. He tried to obtain compensation from the king in vain. However, Spanish expansion in the New World stimulated the interest in the exploration of the Pacific, due to the encouraging reports on Far East reaches from the Portuguese in Macau and then in Nagasaki. Andrés de Urdaneta, who had participated in Loyasa's expedition, would finally find the return to New Spain in 1565 via a northwest-northeast route, after leaving Miguel López de Legazpi to establish a new Spanish colony in the Philippines. Manila was then a good port, conquered in 1571. The annual route of a galleon from Acapulco to Manila was established immediately after and operated until 1815, exchanging silver, but also tobacco, potatoes, peanuts, cacao, and corn for Chinese silks and porcelain, blankets from the Philippines, calicoes and chintz from South Asia, precious stones from Ceylon and South Asia, ivory from Cambodia, ebony from Siam, spices from South Asia and Southeast Asia, Persian carpets, lacquered furniture from Japan. The annual fair in Acapulco was still important at the turn of the 19th century, even after the disruption created by the conquest and brief occupation of the Philippines by the British in 1762-64. However, the Spanish exploration of the Pacific became reduced to the well-established commercial routes connecting Southeast Asia to the Far East, to which was added the main innovation, the regular trip from Acapulco to Manila. The last significant exploration of South Pacific was undertaken by Pedro Fernández de Quirós in 1605-06. Even the political military enterprises were largely reduced to the Moluccas, where the Spaniards replaced the Portuguese at the turn of the 17th century due to the arrival of the Dutch, but their presence did not last long. Military initiatives in Indochina ended up in failure. Since the very beginning, the governors of Manila tried to establish direct links to China, but they were not successful. The best initiative was the embassy of the Augustinian Martin de Rada to Fukien in 1575. He collected manuscripts and left an excellent travel account and a solid report on China with precious military, demographic, and geographic data. The Spaniards depended to a certain degree from the mediation of Macau for trade with China until 1640, when Portugal restored its independence. It is this period from the 1570s to the 1630s that registered a strong presence of new Christians in Macau. They controlled the maritime route from Macau to Manila, but they also invested on the long route from Acapulco, New Spain to Manila, in which we find Diogo Fernandes Vitoria, who became a member of the Municipal Council of Manila, Antonio Diaz de Cáceres, who traveled to Manila and then to Macau, or Manuel Rodriguez Navarro, who ended up in Nagasaki. The immigration of Asian people to New Spain, forced or encouraged by Spaniards, cannot be ignored. They were called Chinos, but they were mainly Malay, Tagalog, Vitians, Chinese, and Japanese. They contributed to the orientalization of New Spain, particularly the diffusion of taste for Asian material culture, but they also had a linguist input acknowledged by several authors, such as José de Acosta. The parallel flux of Asian people to Lisbon did not reach the same level due to longer trips, but the chronicler João de Barros in the mid-16th century wrote about the Chinese language and mentioned a Chinese translator that he used. The initial push of exploration by the Spaniards, who estimated for the first time the size of the Pacific Ocean, was reflected on geography and cartography. New fauna and flora were discovered, adding to the extraordinary increase of knowledge in these fields resulting from the expansion in the New World. The exploration of this vast ocean would develop immensely in the 18th and 19th century with British, French, and Russian voyages, in which immediate commercial gain was replaced by geographic knowledge and long-term political purposes of colonization. Arguably, Magellan's voyage, and I conclude here, Magellan's voyage opened the way for an enormous exchange of knowledge, but also for plunder and exploitation of resources and peoples. The reassertion of Asian powers in past century is about to create a multiple polarized world with a different dynamic of growth, but it is undeniable the irreversible impact of the European expansion and the importance of Magellan's voyage to link different parts of the world. Thank you. Good. Thank you so much. It was really a great pleasure.
Okay, thank you. Okay, bye-bye, and thank you very much.